Hello, welcome back. And after the UAE tour, I thought I'd talk about sprinting and leadouts and just the chaos of it all, because the UAE tour, there's a few like world championships for the sprinters and the leadout trains, and the UAE tour is one of them. This year, slightly dulled down because there was a few sprinters missing due to like COVID that rampaged through the peloton, and quite a lot of lead-out trains missing, our own included. Obviously we're man down with Branley, but Rick and I managed to be there, and Darryl Impey filled in Branley's shoes. Arguably better than Branley would have done actually, but don't tell him I said that. Anyway, so the world champs are UAE Tour, the Champs-Elysees on the Tour de France, that is the pinnacle of sprinting. If you win that, you are like God. So we'll crack on, because you might have seen from the wonderful imagery that Velon put out, clips from inside the peloton. I featured, and so I thought I'd take the opportunity as an insider to give my opinions or thoughts on the chaos, like what the rules are. And these are unwritten rules, these are peloton rules that have like manifested over years and years of bunch sprinting. And kind of the do's and don'ts, and this is nothing to do. I don't actually know what the UCI rulebook says about bunch sprinting. I can imagine what it is, and we'll get onto a couple of the sort of nuances about it, but I've listed it out more for my benefit than yours so I can remember, because there's quite a lot of things to talk about. And I guess we'll talk firstly about prior to 50 kilometers to go. Now, for a team that has a sprint and a lead-out focus, there'll be a plan. This plan's formulated prior, there'll be imagery. If we don't know the run-in, if there's been no chance to do a recon, which is often the case in a Grand Tour, or any stage race in fact, we'll have Google imagery of the roads, we'll have detailed maps, wind directions, and any dangerous points, corners that we have to pay extra attentive for, out of safety and also out of positioning for the sprint. So, and the second part of the plan is how you then execute the lead out to deliver the sprinter in the best way possible. Each rider will have a role, each rider's there for a reason. We're basically we are domestiques to the sprinter, and our purpose lies in the last kind of 5 to 10 kilometers of the race is when you really it's go time. And then also outside of 50 kilometers to go, the peloton, and this is the first touch on etiquette and rules, and that's where you kind of don't shove. Every team's kind of right, and I guess it doesn't specifically apply to sprinting, but if we're talking about a reasonably trouble-free day that is almost certainly going to come down to a lead out, there isn't much pushing and shoving. It's kind of this weird polite fight. Everyone is trying to ride in their teams, everyone's trying to be near the front but not at the front. Everyone kind of wants to be the third team on the road, and if you're not third team, it's rare that a team will make a big song and dance about being there. Some teams they are known, and we'll touch on reputation, history and respect, but some teams are known for wanting to be up the front. Ineos, Movistar, Jumbo being three of them. They are teams that you will often see commandeering those front team positions when it is all lined out. Other teams are happy to sort of float around and then get in the game when it's go time, and that's outside 50k to go. And generally you don't shove. You might ride next to a team for a while and see if they concede the position, because then you're both kind of in the wind, you're both burning more energy, and it's which of you wants it more. So it's just a really passive aggressive polite kind of argument that sometimes you'll even jovially touch elbows and be like, hey, or you just slip back. Generally, if a rider then gives you a shoulder barge, then he'll get screamed at by not just you, but people behind you for just being unnecessarily dangerous at a point where it's just not needed. Obviously, if there's crosswinds coming up or climbs coming up, different story, but this is if it is a bog standard sprint. So that's outside 50k to go, but let's get to the good stuff inside 50k to go. Now, that's when things just get gradually, I'd say exponentially more it's an exponential curve as to how aggressive it gets, and I don't see in front of 800 meters to go, so what I can comment about that really comes down to watching finishes afterwards, talking to the sprinters afterwards about what happened. Like, my job finishes generally, if I've done a good job, 700, 750. So when you get into that final cut and thrust, that's when things do start. The talking stops, the jovial nature stops, the friendliness stops. But there is a limit, and we'll talk about this a fair bit. There is a limit to the amount of pushing, and if you push too much, you're going to get shouted at. If you don't push enough, you're going to get pushed around. And there's three types of rider, and that is where you are either feared, you are friendly, or you're respected. Now, you're respected is simple. It's the sprinters, like the sprinters that win. It's the GC riders that are having to be up there. It's just the massive names, like, you know, if Roglic in UAE, Pogacar, like you. And from a rider who isn't one of those, it's kind of, you don't want to mess up their race because it's not your race. Like, you don't want to be the guy that brings down Froome in a sprint and ruins his race. So generally, the respected ones you steer clear of, literally steer clear of. Unfortunately, if you've got a respected rider on your right and someone not so much on your left, like a domestic like yourself, unfortunately you're leaning, and the gap's closing, you're leaning to the left. It's the nature of it. Unfortunately, I'm the guy that's lent on, and I'm a guy that turns out the way of those respected riders. Feared are the guys that are mental, like the guys that will never concede a position, and they will happily go down, probably take you with them if you fight them for it. They're quite well known. They're not super friendly in the bunch generally. They've gone into cycling with a I am going to be feared by the peloton mentality, and whether you like it or not, that often works for them. And you can't, you can be as unhappy with them as you like, but what you cannot do is ride around their aggressiveness. You have to, you know who they are, and you have to be like, this isn't going to end well for me. I'm going to turn left into the guy that isn't that. And then the last one, which I'd say is a lot of the peloton, is the friendly rider. And I like to think that's where I sit in. And so what we try to do is respect lead outs. So you try not to cut through a lead out train. You say, like, I can't go through. Like, you give space when it's time to give space, and you hope that it kind of in the spirit of good racing, in the spirit of fair racing, in the spirit of these like weird cycling, I guess every sport, unwritten rules that like we have and are not governed by the powers that be. And then when it's time to go, or it's time that you need that space, you hope that the guys that you've been friendly to, and that it's kind of like karma, you hope that respect is given both ways. And that's, I guess that does come back to the respected part, but it's a different kind of respect. And it's interesting, just on a side note, how different riders go into their pro career. And I had this chat in the UAE with one rider. It's like, I've gone into my pro career thinking everyone is friendly, and then they prove me differently, or they prove me right in the way that they ride. Another rider I spoke to, I can't use the words he actually used, but he goes in and thinks that everyone is an unpleasant person, and then waits for them to prove him wrong. So it's kind of a pessimistic or an optimistic attitude towards the whole peloton. So we'll talk about the etiquette and the unwritten rules. Lead-out trains, you don't cut through a lead-out train. You do not cut a teammate off of his wheel, and that's a big no-no, and that is one that is widely respected. Unfortunately, when the bunch compresses, whether that be because the road's narrowed, there's a corner, there's teams just moving through, riders do get cut off, and there's nothing you can do. You'll see riders like stood up, pulled their elbows in like to get through a gap, and it's just like, there's nothing I can do because there's just not enough space for that rider's handlebars. And sometimes it'll be like a sorry, or sometimes it'll be like I was squeezed, and everyone kind of understands. But in the most part, you do not disrupt another lead-out train's train. The pushing and shoving is a real funny one, because it's so grey as to what is too much and what is not enough. And you would, like I said, you would have seen on the velo, there was a velon imagery, there was a lot of pushing and shoving, there was a lot of it is circumstantial, the bunch has moved, and when I say pushing, I don't mean hands, I mean like a shoulder into someone else, and sometimes it's often not your fault. Sometimes you do have to lean on people to get into a position that you need to be for your team, and it's tough because it's a fine line. You're pushing your luck, and there doesn't seem to be any rules about that, but it's like a too much situation in the peloton where it's like, no, that was too much, or that was okay, fair enough. And it's such a fine line, and it's very difficult to judge. And like I said, as you get closer to the finish, that what's deemed okay or not okay gets more aggressive, I guess. And in the 1 or 2 times I've been at the sharp end in the last 500 meters, it can be nuts. It can also be better because everything's strung out and everyone's on their hands and knees, but it can be terrifying. Taking hands off the bars though, now that's something that's come up recently by a few channels and a few videos that have come up. Now, taking hands off the bars, I think that isn't allowed, UCI, not allowed. However, there is a huge difference between a hands off the bars and push and a hands off the bars and like a tap with like a, hey mate, I'm here. And that tap might be because a gap's closing, and there's a rider that you know, like one of these friends riders who you know won't want to disrupt you if you're trying to follow your teammate through a gap. If you give them your tap, you say, hey mate, and they have a look over, they see the same coloured mitts to the jersey in front, or they see you, and they try and move out the way. And that's used a lot. But a full-on shove, it's a no-go in any situation at any point of the race in a bunch sprint. And that's, is something that I think a lot of riders have done and then immediately regretted because you see the consequences firsthand. It's something that I made a mistake of once, and immediately wasn't consequences, but I got screamed at for it, and by a rider, I was young. I was like, okie dokie, that's a no-go. So that was that, live and learn. And the last thing we'll talk about is line deviation. And again, this is where I think it's tough for the UCI, the commissaires, because again, it's grey. It seems to often be the case that a sanction is given when there is a crash or an injury, which isn't right. It should be black and white, but the problem is it is not black and white. The finish line is not always straight. We had one stage, I think it was stage 4 or 5 of the UAE Tour, where it was a straight line was to deviate from your line. So do you follow the curve of the road, but you're taking a long way to your finish line? If you're in front, can you bolt straight for the line? And then that's really tough, I think, to determine what is a line deviation. I guess the solution is to paint lines on the road. Perhaps, I don't know, let me know what you think. And the last overarching problem with sprints and lead-outs is, number one is the plan. Generally every team with a lead-out train will have the same plan, and often that plan, there's only enough room on the road for one team to execute the plan properly, so you've got a lot of teams vying to do exactly the same thing, but also to arrive there having not done too much prior. It's about being not too late, but also not too early, and that's tough to judge. And the second thing is just space on the road. There isn't enough, not for every team to get things perfectly formed, and that makes things monumentally difficult. And that's why some people love it, some people don't, and that is why sprinting is chaotic, lead outs are chaotic, and that's kind of why I love it. So, thanks for watching.